Yeah, hi, Stephen. Thank you for tonight's talk. It's a question I've asked myself before, what's really important in life? And as you were giving your Dharma talk, and I was picturing myself on my deathbed, what was going through my mind is that, well, ideally, I want to be at peace. I want to be totally accepting of what's going on, feeling grateful for my life. So, are you saying that these are ego's answers to that question? I'm a little bit confused.
Okay. I guess what I'm saying, I hope trying to get across at least, is to go beyond the easy answers that the ego may provide, and to dig deeper. So a typical easy answer from the ego is, I want enlightenment, right? Because the ego, to an ego, well, that's cool, right? I mean, especially to an ego that's achieved a lot already, has gone the maybe wealth, status, fame, relationship, all those, kind of checked off the box, and still doesn't feel fulfilled. Enlightenment can be the final kind of desire. It's called the final desire because it can be the final desire of the ego. I'm asking, and that happens. I mean, that's fine. That's just what's happening. In fact, that how it may unfold for many of us, and the ego thinks it's going to find fulfillment through enlightenment. It starts down that road, and then sort of halfway down the road, it realizes that, wait a minute, there's nothing in this for me. This is actually the end for me as the ego. This is deconstructing this entity that thinks it's there, the separate self, psychological self, whatever we call it, the thing that we think is real, that I was referring to in the guided meditation. So it starts to resist. So, oh, maybe we don't want to do this. And then that's when spiritual practice can really go off the rails, right? Because we can believe the resistances. And what I'm saying is, what keeps us going is if we really know deeply what the most important thing to us is, not what the ego thinks is most important, but at our deepest level, what's of the utmost importance. And some of those things you raised are worth exploring in terms of utmost importance. And it occurred to me that the ego lets go at the time of death. In fact, death can be seen as kind of forced enlightenment because the ego is gone. The psychological self is gone. Right before death, the concerns of the ego are not as prominent as pushing, if that's the word. So that's a moment, if we can imagine it, where we can look into what's more deeply important to us. So yeah, it's not an ego, what's important to the ego. It's moving beyond what's important to the ego to what's most deeply, and I use the word existential. I don't know if that's the right word. It's that kind of what questions would be most crucial to you understanding, realizing the truth of what's the most important thing. And it could be anything, from truth to love to just you have to find out for yourself. for me, truth became the most important thing. I wanted to know the truth, and at some point, you realize that this may be more. This is not exactly what the ego bargained for. That's for sure. And knowing truth means that you're no longer enthralled and entangled with the ego, and the ego is no longer in the driver's seat. That may not even be what's most important to you. So you really have to find out for yourself. But again, to directly answer your questions, it's not what the ego thinks. I'm asking you to move beyond the egoic, what's important to the ego, and looking deeper and deeper and deeper into what's the most important thing. There's a good book by Adyashanti. I think it's actually called The Most Important Thing or something along those lines. The first, as I remember it, I haven't read it in some time. The first half of the book really talks about more about what I'm referring to here is discovering the most important thing. And probably Ajay probably planted that seed in my practice, right? And that became something that motivated, my investigation is uncovering what was most important. And at that point, once what's most important beyond what the ego thinks is important, you don't get sidetracked by the ego desires quite as much, right? Because you keep coming back. Wait, the shiny objects, experiences, whatever we want to call it, aren't ultimately what's important. It's this other thing that I uncovered. It's much deeper. That's of the utmost importance. So I want to get back to my investigation. Get back to that looking deeply, as we did in the guided meditation. That was really it really unfolded as a way of continually stepping away from what's important to the ego to what's it's touching into beingness and what emerges as what's of the utmost importance from beingness.
What occurred to me when you were talking and asking the question in the Dharma talk is that, I think we all want peace and acceptance at the point of death. And that doesn't happen automatically. That's something that has to be practiced moment to moment. But if I'm hearing you, there might be something even deeper than that. And that's what has to be sat with, so to speak. That's kind of the easy answer. I want peace, I want acceptance, but if I'm hearing you right, could be something even deeper than that, and the only way to know that is to sit with the question.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
And I like the way you put sit with the question, because that's really what it is. It's not figuring it out. It's just simply floating out what's at the deepest level of the utmost importance. Mm-hmm. What's the most important thing to me? As Ajay, I think that's how he put it. And then the investigation just follows from that. I guess another way to come at this, just kind of occurred to me, is why do we even step back from the content of experience, the sense perceptions, thoughts, emotions, body sensations? And Why do we step back from that and sense into presence, or whatever we want to call it? Just because a meditation teacher says to? So there is some impulse that consciousness or presence has to know itself. And it manifests in human beings. Right? All enlightenment is consciousness becoming aware of itself. And there's this impulse for consciousness to become aware of itself through these animated human beings. There's the capacity there for consciousness to know itself through us. So there is this impulse. It's not seeking. It's a spiritual impulse, a movement that's there. And so part of knowing what's most important is kind of touching into that spiritual impulse and feeling into it. Because when you feel into that impulse, you really get a sense of what's unfolding. And that's when investigation, of course, really starts to, I'll use the word flourish. It takes on a life of its own. And the ego resistances then just seem so petty in comparison. The fears that the ego raises is this kind of like, there it is. But when we don't really sense into that impulse, that spiritual impulse, and we don't sense into what's most important to us, those egoic fears and resistances can be believed much more easily. And then we get sidetracked. We get pulled off the path, even pulled off the investigation, the inquiry. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. And that, I think, is what, when I reflected on this topic of investigation or inquiry, I thought, I kept thinking back to my personal journey, and what there was a point where investigations really changed. It didn't become a mechanical thing. I didn't worry about if I was doing it right. I didn't need to read any books about how to do inquiry. I didn't need another teaching about, like a Ramana teaching on asking, what am I? Or a Joseph Goldstein teaching on looking at, rephrasing, rather than I, this, it's saying this is just occurring, or a Stephen teaching on the 5 aggregates, or, all these different teachings that, of course, just give us more categories and frameworks for doing the same thing, which is seeing the illusion of the separate self, seeing the unreality of the separate self is even more accurate.